The evening crept in, unnoticed, wrapping the neighborhood in that gentle, persistent silence only suburban streets seemed to hold. The kitchen was full of soft shadows, the air thick with the smell of roasted chicken, and something faintly floral from the candle I kept by the window, not for romance but for company. I set the table as I always did, careful with the napkins, smoothing out invisible wrinkles, paying more attention to the little things than to myself. My husband was late, which by now had become more routine than surprise, a steady beat in our life that no longer had music. Sometimes I wondered if he'd notice if I started cooking for 2 instead of 3, if I left out his favorite mug, or simply forgot to iron his shirts. I doubted it. Our conversations were now about groceries bills who needed to pick up the dry cleaning. His laughter when it came belonged to football commentators, or his phone never to me. He wasn't cruel, just absent, absorbed into his world of numbers, business calls, silent dinners, the blue glow of television across his face at night. He hadn't touched me, not really. Not in that way that leaves your skin buzzing and your thoughts a mess in months, maybe longer. I'd stopped counting. Tonight, I put on a soft, slate blue slip under my sweater, not because I expected him to notice, but because it made me feel like I could still be noticed by someone somewhere. The silk was cool against my skin, a private rebellion beneath layers of normalcy. While I moved through the familiar routine, checking the oven, tidying the counter, I let myself drift into memories of being wanted, remembered, before we became more like roommates than lovers. A knock at the door, not hurried or urgent, measured almost polite. I wiped my hands and went to answer, already knowing who it would be. He lived next door, always seemed to have a project going, fixing his fence, repainting the porch, trimming the hedge between our yards. Tonight he stood on my step, with a half smile holding out a set of keys that must have fallen from my mailbox. His eyes held a kind of mischief, but not the reckless kind, just enough to make me aware of myself in ways my husband's gaze never did. "Thought you might need these," he said, handing them over his fingers, grazing mine just briefly. For a moment, I was hyper-aware of everything, how my breath caught, how my sweater suddenly felt too warm, how I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He lingered a second too long on the porch. We spoke of small things, the garden, the neighbor's new dog, how early the evenings darkened now, but beneath each word something simmered, a silent acknowledgement of a boundary neither of us had crossed, but both of us seemed to circle. He made a joke about my overgrown roses, and I laughed a real easy laugh that felt strange in my mouth, the kind of laugh that hadn't belonged to this house in years. When he left, I watched his figure disappear into the gathering twilight, feeling the echo of his presence long after the door had closed. In the mirror later, I caught myself smiling an involuntary, foolish thing, like a secret I hadn't meant to keep. That night, after my husband came home late, tired, a kiss on my forehead, and a quick murmur about tomorrow's schedule, I lay awake, tracing invisible patterns across the ceiling with my thoughts. I thought about the neighbor's hands, the warmth in his voice, the way he seemed to look right at me, not through me. Somewhere in that long stretch between midnight and morning, I realized I was hoping for another knock at the door, not for the keys, not for the roses, but just to feel that current again, that small jolt of being seen, if only for a minute. And as the world outside shifted from black to gray, I wondered almost against my will how tomorrow would begin. The next day began with the same careful choreography that had come to define my mornings. My husband was already gone by the time I woke his side of the bed, cool the echo of his departure, barely a ripple in the quiet. I moved through the kitchen like a shadow, my robe trailing behind me as I made coffee, tidied the counter, sorted through the familiar clutter of the mail. Each gesture felt almost performative, as if I were playing the part of someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's reliable fixture in a neat, well-kept house. The sun warmed the kitchen tiles, glinting off the stainless steel and lighting up dust motes in the air. I stood at the window looking into the backyard, watching the neighbor tend to his garden. He worked with a kind of intent focus, but there was a looseness to his movements, a rhythm, a physical confidence I found myself envying. I watched him longer than I meant to, not realizing until he glanced up, caught my gaze, and lifted a hand in greeting. I hesitated only a moment before waving back. Midday came and went. My errands, once a distraction, now seemed tedious. The grocery store was full of other women moving like I did, heads down, lists in hand, faces drawn with concentration or fatigue. In the frozen foods aisle, a man bumped his cart into mine and muttered an apology. I barely registered him. My thoughts had drifted back to the neighbor, the look in his eyes, the feeling of being noticed. Back home, I unpacked groceries in a haze, distracted by the quiet thrill that seemed to linger from the night before. It wasn't love, I told myself, not even infatuation, just the memory of a charged moment, the awareness of possibility. Late in the afternoon, as I was sweeping the patio, I heard his voice over the fence. "Need a hand?" He leaned on the gate, casual, but there was something in the way he watched me, almost expectant, like he was waiting for me to say yes to something neither of us would name. I laughed. "If you don't mind risking a blister." I handed him the broom, our fingers brushing. The contact was brief, but I felt it everywhere, a subtle electric buzz beneath my skin. He worked beside me, his sleeves rolled up, the sun catching in the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. We talked about the patio stones, the stubborn weed in the corner, the possibility of rain. Our words circled each other, harmless on the surface, but loaded with meaning just beneath. He paused, looking at me with that same searching gaze. "You always do everything yourself." I shrugged. "Most things." He smiled but didn't push. Instead, he pointed to a patch of wildflowers along the fence. "You know, those used to grow all over my grandmother's yard. She said they kept the snakes away." "Does it work?" I asked, smiling back. He shook his head, laughing. "Not at all. But it gave her something to believe in." We stood quietly, the air dense with the scent of grass and earth. The ordinary world around us seemed to blur at the edges, the familiar transformed by a charge that neither of us acknowledged aloud. When I reached down to gather up a pile of leaves, he stepped closer, and for a heartbeat, we were both still. He didn't ask for permission. The moment was so subtle, so natural, it felt as though it had always been waiting there for us. His lips brushed mine, tentative, almost questioning, and I felt myself responding before I'd even made a decision. The taste of him was new and startlingly vivid, sunlight and sweat, and something bittersweet. He drew back first, searching my face for regret or anger, but all I could do was stare at him, trying to remember the last time I had felt this alive. The world resumed its motion around us, birdsong, distant laughter, a car passing on the street. But in that moment, I was rooted to the spot, changed in some small, irreversible way. I should have felt guilt, maybe even panic, but instead there was a spreading warmth, a sense of awakening that hummed in my blood. He stepped back, the familiar lines of his face rearranged by something like hope, and handed the broom back to me. "Looks like you've got it covered," he said, his voice low. I watched him leave, his footsteps fading down the path, and pressed my fingers to my lips. The patio was half swept, but I couldn't bring myself to finish the job. Inside the house seemed both emptier and fuller all at once. A sanctuary, a trap, a place where the rules had changed without warning. That evening, as I lay in bed beside my husband, his back turned to me, breath slow and even, I closed my eyes and replayed every detail of the afternoon, the heat of the sun, the roughness of his palm, the dizzying feeling of being wanted. I listened to the small sounds of the night, searching for meaning in their quiet persistence, and wondered how long I could keep this new part of myself hidden, but I didn't want to let it go. I didn't want to forget how it felt to be seen, to be chosen, to be alive. And as sleep crept in, I found myself longing for the next impossible, inevitable encounter. The next morning brought with it a cool gray drizzle, the kind that blurred the outlines of trees and left the world soft around the edges. I stood at the kitchen window, cradling my coffee, watching rivulets of rain snake down the glass. In the muted light, the garden looked different, lush, secretive, as if hiding something just beneath its surface. I caught myself searching for movement on the neighbor's side, the flash of a jacket or the sound of his boots in the wet grass, but there was only the steady hush of rain and the lingering taste of yesterday's kiss on my lips. My husband left for work with a brief touch on my shoulder. Eyes glazed over with thoughts of meetings, deadlines, the perpetual grind that seemed to swallow the better part of him. I watched him go, feeling a pang that was not quite guilt, not quite longing, just the sharp ache of distance. When the door closed, the house grew larger, the rooms more echoing than before. I moved through them restlessly, unable to settle every surface, reminding me of who I was supposed to be. By midday, the rain had eased, leaving everything outside dripping and impossibly green. I busied myself with small chores, folding towels, rearranging books on the shelf, wiping down the kitchen counter for the third time. But nothing seemed to erase the restless energy crackling under my skin. When my phone buzzed, I nearly dropped it in surprise. A message. "Need anything from the hardware store, heading out soon?" The words were simple, but I read them over and over, the possibility vibrating beneath each letter. I wrote back, "I could use some company if that's on offer." The response came quickly, a short "pick you up in 10." I found myself racing to the bedroom, heart pounding, as I slipped out of my house clothes and into something that felt less invisible. Dark jeans, a pale blouse, a touch of perfume I'd almost forgotten I owned. I hesitated in front of the mirror, smoothing my hair, trying to appear casual. But my eyes betrayed me. There was a light there, a reckless hunger. When his car pulled up, I locked the door behind me with a sense of ceremony. The drive was short, but charged, filled with talk of inconsequentials, the traffic, the latest scandal at City Hall, a neighbor's dog that kept escaping its yard. Yet every laugh, every glance seemed to hold a second meaning. The city center was busy despite the drizzle, people moving quickly between stores, ducking under awnings, faces half hidden by umbrellas. I followed him into the hardware store, the sharp tang of metal and sawdust in the air rows of tools and paint chips stretching endlessly. We wandered the aisles, our bodies unconsciously in sync, finding reasons to linger in narrow spaces, sharing jokes over the absurd names of screws and brackets. Once reaching for a tape measure, his hand brushed mine, and I felt the current pass between us, sharp and undeniable. I wondered if the cashier saw anything in the way we stood together, if strangers could sense the storm building beneath our quiet exchange. On the drive back, the city faded into the green of the suburbs, and the air between us thickened with anticipation. He turned the radio down, the soft hum of music filling the silence. For a moment he glanced at me, a question in his eyes. "Is this strange for you?" His voice was tentative, more vulnerable than I'd heard before. I hesitated, choosing my words with care. "Everything feels strange lately, but not wrong." He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You deserve to feel more than just comfortable, you know." I looked out the window, the world sliding past in blurred colors, thinking of all the years I'd spent convincing myself that comfort was enough. We pulled into my driveway, but neither of us moved to get out. The car became its own world, warm, enclosed, private. Rain tapped lightly on the windshield. He reached for my hand, his thumb tracing circles against my palm. The touch was both grounding and electrifying, a wordless promise that settled deep inside me. "I wish I could explain why this feels so important," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "You don't have to," he replied, his voice a hush between us. "Sometimes you just know." We sat in the quiet for a moment longer, the boundary between restraint and surrender growing thinner. I wanted to kiss him again, to close the space between us, but I also wanted to savor this charged anticipation, this feeling of being on the verge of something both dangerous and necessary. Eventually I opened the car door, the damp air rushing in, grounding me in reality once more. "Thank you," I said, lingering on the threshold. He smiled, a small, knowing curve of his lips. "Any time." I stepped out, closing the door behind me with a soft click. My legs felt unsteady as I walked up the path, the world humming with color and light. Inside, I set the bag of screws on the kitchen table, my hands trembling ever so slightly. Every object in the house seemed sharper, more significant. A glass, a book, the blue slip still hidden at the bottom of the laundry basket. That evening I replayed the day in fragments, the drive, the hardware store, his hand on mine, the quiet confessions that hung between words. I fell asleep to the rhythm of rain against the window and the certainty that for the first time in years, the story of my life was no longer being written for me, but by me. And somewhere just out of reach tomorrow waited, carrying the promise of another chance to choose something, someone real. The days that followed seemed to settle into a different kind of rhythm, one colored by anticipation and edged with secrecy. My senses had sharpened, every sound in the house felt amplified, every glance from my husband tinged with the question of what he really saw when he looked at me. Yet our routines held fast. He left early. I tidied up meals, appeared and disappeared from the table with mechanical regularity. The air was thick with everything unspoken, our marriage ticking along like a watch that no longer quite kept the right time. One evening of Friday, I found him waiting for me in the living room, the curtains drawn against the dusk. There were candles on the sideboard, and a bottle of red wine breathing on the table. He'd even set the old stereo to play something soft, Frank Sinatra, the soundtrack of our early days together. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I once fell in love with, the one who would pull me onto the kitchen tiles to dance while the soup boiled over. He gestured for me to sit awkward and hopeful. I thought we could have a nice dinner, just the two of us. I hesitated only a moment before nodding and sitting down, my mind already scrambling for a way to keep the evening from slipping into performance. He poured the wine, handed me a glass, and raised his own. To us, I watched him over the rim, searching his face for any sign that he knew how far I'd drifted, but he only smiled, trying so hard it hurt to watch. Dinner was lamb a cut he'd ordered specially. The conversation was careful at first, as if we were both afraid of shattering the delicate peace. He asked about my day, my plans for the weekend. I answered, keeping my replies light, almost rehearsed. There was a desperation in the way he leaned forward, trying to catch my eye to connect. Every compliment, every awkward joke landed between us with a thud. Halfway through the meal, he reached across the table, placing his hand over mine. His palm was warm, slightly trembling. "I miss you. You know," he said softly, as though he feared the admission might send me running. "I know I haven't been really here for a while." I swallowed, unsure how to respond. His touch, once familiar, now felt foreign, like a favorite sweater gone tight in the arms. I remembered how different the neighbor's hand had felt, steady, curious, the grip of someone who saw me as something other than a fixture in the house. He tried to lighten the mood, making a joke about our failed vacation last year, and for a moment I managed to smile, but it felt thin, strained. The space between us was crowded with memories neither of us could name. After dinner, he produced a small box wrapped in gold paper. "I got you something," he said, pressing it into my hand. Inside was a silver locket, lovely, intricate, but somehow weightless, as if it belonged to someone else. "It's beautiful," I said, and he seemed so relieved that I felt a wave of guilt, sharp and cold. We moved to the sofa. He put his arm around my shoulders, pulling me closer, but the warmth of his body felt distant. His breath against my cheek, just another reminder of how much space now lay between us. He kissed my temple, gentle, familiar, but lacking the hunger I'd found elsewhere. "I'm trying," he murmured into my hair. "I know," I whispered, not trusting myself to say more. We sat in silence, Sinatra crooning about lost chances in the background. I closed my eyes, focusing on the sensation of being held, the outline of his hand on my arm, the echo of another touch on my lips. I thought about how desire could vanish and reappear, how a single look could redraw the boundaries of a life. When he finally released me, I stood and went to the kitchen, under the pretense of making tea. I leaned against the counter, the new locket heavy at my throat, tears stinging my eyes. It was not anger I felt, nor resentment, just a bone-deep sadness, a sense of inevitability. There was so much we'd lost without even noticing. After tea, we watched television. My husband's laughter was too loud, too eager. He reached for my hand and I let him, but my thoughts wandered elsewhere, to a hand that would meet mine with purpose, to eyes that would search my face not for reassurance, but for recognition. That night I lay beside him, wide awake, counting the minutes between his breaths. I listened to the wind rattling the windows, the rain starting up again, and tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly wanted. I traced the edge of the locket at my neck and wondered if I'd ever know how to tell him the truth about what I needed. In the darkness, the memory of my neighbor's voice replayed in my mind. Sometimes you just know. I knew only that something in me was changing, becoming bolder, less afraid of what might happen if I reached out for more. By morning, the unease had settled into resolve. I dressed with more care than usual, choosing a silk camisole beneath my blouse, the sensation of it against my skin, a secret promise to myself. As I glanced in the mirror, I recognized the glimmer of risk in my own eyes, and for the first time, I didn't turn away. The day stretched out before me, filled with new uncertainty and old longing. I told myself I was simply running errands, tidying the house, living the life I'd always lived. But underneath it all, I waited for a sign for a moment, for the chance to let something real break through the surface. The days blurred into one another, and with each passing hour, the weight of the previous evening pressed harder on my chest. My husband's attempt to restore romance left a film of regret and sadness over everything I touched. I tried to shake it off in the kitchen the next morning, whisking eggs for breakfast with more vigor than necessary, but nothing seemed to clear the residue. I wore the locket not out of love, but obligation. It was heavy and cold, a reminder of everything I was pretending not to feel. The world outside, however, was bright with the promise of spring. The scent of lilacs drifted in through the open window, and the distant drone of a lawnmower lent an odd comfort to the day. I folded laundry in the living room, careful and methodical, though my mind wandered ceaselessly. The memory of my neighbor's hand, the way he looked at me not for comfort, but with genuine desire, persisted with an almost physical ache. I could feel it in the tips of my fingers, a hunger that no amount of housework could numb just after. Lunch. My phone buzzed a short message. "Can you help me pick out paint for the hallway? Need a second opinion?" My heart leapt and then stilled, nervousness and anticipation wrestling within me. I checked myself in the mirror before leaving, smoothing my hair, applying a subtle touch of blush. I changed into a fresh blouse and a skirt that skimmed my knees, simple but elegant, and beneath it all chose black lace underwear, not for anyone else to see, but for the thrill of knowing it was there. His house smelled different from mine, spicier with the faintest trace of wood polish and old books. Sunlight sliced across the floor in golden lines. He had a handful of paint samples spread out on the table, but I could tell by his grin that he cared little about the colors. He gestured for me to sit beside him, and we began the charade of comparing swatches, holding them to the wall, debating subtle differences between eggshell and almond cream. Our conversation was light, but charged an undercurrent of something unspoken passing between us with every glance and brush of hands. After a while, the pretense dissolved. He turned to me, eyes lingering on my mouth, his fingers resting just a moment too long on my wrist as I handed him a sample. My breath caught. I felt my body responding, my pulse quickening, my skin sensitizing to the distance between us. The memory of the locket against my collarbone felt like an anchor. I reached for it instinctively, and he noticed. He didn't speak. Instead, he leaned in, closing the space between us. His hand cupped my cheek, his thumb skimming my jaw, and I let myself lean forward into the warmth of his touch. The kiss that followed was nothing like our first, a gentle testing thing, but rather urgent, desperate, deepened by everything we had held back. My hand slid into his hair, and for a moment, the rest of the world dissolved. There was no house, no husband, no past or future, only this moment where I was wanted, needed, and absolutely alive. When the kiss finally broke, I drew back slowly, trying to steady my breathing. He pressed his forehead to mine, his hand moving to my waist. The nearness of him, the way our bodies fit together, felt terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I was hyper-aware of every sensation, the heat of his palm through the thin fabric of my blouse, the scratch of his stubble along my jaw, the way his chest rose and fell against mine. A sharp trill broke the moment my phone ringing from inside my bag, insistent and jarring. I froze, untangling myself, my hand shaking as I checked the caller ID. My husband. For a split second, I considered ignoring it, but the weight of reality returned like a cold splash of water. I stepped away, breathless, answering as normally as I could. He asked about dinner, about whether I'd remember to pick up his shirts. I answered, my voice steady, my eyes locked on the neighbors. He listened in silence, watching me navigate the mundane world I still belonged to. When I hung up, he didn't ask questions. Instead, he traced a slow line down my arm, and I shivered, not from fear, but from the simple fact that I wanted more. I knew I should leave, return to the safety of routine. Instead, I lingered, helping him stack the paint samples, making small talk about wall colors and weekend plans. Every brush of our hands was a promise, every shared glance a dare. He poured 2 glasses of cold water and handed me one, our fingers grazing again, and we sipped in companionable quiet. "You could stay a little longer," he said softly, his voice low, almost teasing. "No one's expecting you back yet." For a moment I considered saying yes, letting the day slide away in secret pleasure, but I shook my head more out of self-preservation than virtue. I should go. He walked me to the door, the air charged between us, the memory of our kiss still burning on my lips. We didn't say goodbye. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound inadequate or false. Outside, the sunlight seemed sharper, the air clearer. The world continued unchanged, as if my secret belonged only to me. I walked home slowly, the sensation of his touch lingering on my skin. Inside my house, the locket felt heavier than ever, an artifact from a life I was starting to outgrow. I made dinner, cleaned, the kitchen, smiled for my husband, all the while replaying every detail from the afternoon. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, my body humming with a restlessness that had no name. I turned the locket over and over in my hand, the cool metal warming with my touch, and wondered how long I could keep living this double life. How long before desire overcame caution, before longing unraveled the careful threads of my days. But beneath all the worry and the guilt, there was something else, a sense of anticipation, bright and sharp. I had crossed a line and there would be no going back. I wanted more. I craved the next meeting, the next chance to be seen, touched, known. And in the darkness, I promised myself I would not let this feeling slip away so easily. Morning came with a brittle clarity, sunlight pooling on the hardwood floors and splintering the shadows. The ordinary world reasserted itself with quiet insistence, the kettle's whistle, the creak of the front steps, the measured ticking of the hallway clock. But beneath the veneer of order, everything felt altered. I moved through the rooms as if watching myself from a distance, folding my husband's shirts, emptying the dishwasher, collecting the stray socks that always seemed to find their way beneath the couch. Even my reflection seemed unfamiliar, the planes of my face sharper, my eyes bright with something dangerous. My husband had settled into a pattern of gentle attentiveness since the night of our dinner. He offered to help with chores, remembered to bring home my favorite coffee, asked after my day with practiced concern. There was nothing cruel or careless in his manner, and yet I felt increasingly suffocated by his kindness. I knew he was trying, and that knowledge only sharpened my own sense of guilt. I watched him closely, searching his face for signs of suspicion or doubt, but found only the earnest, slightly puzzled affection of a man trying to repair something he could not name. My thoughts kept circling back to my neighbor, the way his touch had left my skin tingling, the memory of his lips pressed to mine, the way he looked at me as if I were both mystery and answer. I felt as if I existed in 2 parallel worlds, one shaped by habit and obligation, the other by desire and anticipation. Every moment seemed stretched between these opposing currents. When I lay beside my husband at night, I became acutely aware of the distance between our bodies, the way our legs never touched, the way his hand found my shoulder out of routine, not longing. I found myself dressing with more care each day, even when I had nowhere to go. I chose softer fabrics, lingered over the selection of my underwear lace silk colors that felt like private confessions. I painted my lips in subtle, flattering shades, styled my hair in ways I hadn't bothered with for years. The act of getting ready became a ritual, a silent declaration that I was more than invisible, more than just the caretaker of someone else's life. Sometimes I would catch my from the doorway as I fastened an earring or smoothed the hem of my skirt. There was curiosity in his gaze, perhaps a faint alarm, but he never asked questions. I wondered if he sensed the change, if the new perfume I wore or the silk camisole beneath my sweater had become a message he was afraid to decipher. I filled the days with errands, the post office, the grocery store, even a midday walk through the city park where the benches were slick with last night's rain. I needed the movement, the distraction. But underneath every activity pulsed the memory of the neighbor's hand on my waist, his voice murmuring low and amused in my ear. Found myself glancing at his house more often, searching for glimpses of him through open windows or glimpsed over the fence. Each time I caught sight of him trimming a hedge, carrying groceries, talking on the phone, I felt a sharp flutter in my chest, a surge of longing that threatened to unmoor me. One afternoon, as I was sorting laundry in the back room, I heard footsteps outside. A quick rap on the side door startled me. I turned, heart racing. He stood in the sunlight, a small smile on his lips, holding a box of garden tools. "Thought you might like these for the flower beds," he said, voice low, as if he were telling me a secret. I accepted them, my hands trembling. We stood close, the air thick with words we didn't say. His fingers brushed mine as I took the box, the contact brief but electric. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes lingering on my face. "I like seeing you like this," he said quietly, alive. I looked away, suddenly shy. I'm not sure what I am anymore. He reached out just enough to let his knuckles graze the back of my hand. "You're real. That's enough." The moment stretched between us, a fragile thread pulled taut. I knew I should step back, close the door, retreat into the safety of routine. But I stood there memorizing the lines of his face, the way sunlight made his hair glow gold at the edges. Eventually he stepped away, and I exhaled, my heart pounding. I watched him disappear around the corner of the house, the box of tools clutched to my chest as if it contained some rare and precious thing. Inside, the air felt charged, every sense heightened. I arranged the tools on the table, my hands unsteady, and pressed my palms to my cheeks to cool the flush there. I was both terrified and exhilarated, longing and ashamed. I moved through the house, unable to settle the longing inside me, growing louder, impossible to ignore. That evening, as my husband and I ate dinner in silence, I caught myself glancing at the clock, counting the hours, until I could retreat to my room, to solitude, to memory. When he reached across the table to brush a crumb from my chin, I flinched so subtly I hoped he wouldn't notice. His brow furrowed, but he said nothing, returning to his meal. Later, alone in bed, I replayed every detail of the afternoon, the warmth of the neighbor's touch, shimmer of his gaze, the way I felt suspended between two versions of myself, one known, one daring. I wanted more. I was hungry for something I could neither name nor suppress. Sleep came late and fitful, haunted by dreams of sunlight and skin of secrets exchanged in half-whispered conversations. Morning would come again, the world would return to its familiar script, but I knew the script no longer fit. My life was splitting open, and something bright and irrepressible was shining through the cracks. It was early evening when the familiar hush of the neighborhood was broken by the clatter of dishes and bursts of laughter drifting in through our kitchen window. My husband had insisted on inviting a few neighbors for dinner, a casual gathering he'd called it, meant to foster some sense of community that had long gone dormant between us and the world outside our door. I moved through the preparations like an actor learning her lines, setting out plates, slicing bread, arranging flowers in a vase that had not seen water since last year's holidays. Underneath my practiced smile, tension simmered, a kind of restless energy that made my hands tremble as I filled the glasses, polished the silverware. Guests arrived in slow, uneven waves, the front hallway echoing with polite greetings and the shuffle of coats and shoes. My husband welcomed each person with awkward warmth, his laughter a little too loud, his gaze lingering on me as if hoping I'd play along. I felt the collective weight of expectations settle on my shoulders. The house, which only hours before had been a haven for my secrets, was now stage-lit and crowded with other people's voices. It was only when the last guest entered that I felt my heart skip, a subtle tightening of breath that no one else seemed to notice. My neighbor. He crossed the threshold with practiced ease, offering a bottle of wine and a quip about how he hoped we weren't serving anything too fancy, or he'd have to leave hungry. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that glance passed all the things we could never say in the light of day. I felt the air shift around us, charged and expectant. Dinner was served, a blur of small talk and gentle clinking of cutlery. the background noise of a life still running according to the rules. I caught snatches of conversation, children's schools' vacation plans, the endless woes of garden pests. My husband sat at the head of the table, steering the talk with nervous authority, occasionally catching my eye, as if seeking reassurance that everything was as it should be. But my focus drifted again and again to my neighbor. He sat across from me close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body through the crowded room. Occasionally, his knee brushed mine beneath the table, a ghost of a touch that sent sparks through my veins. Our conversation was light, but layered, each word chosen carefully, our jokes laced with private meanings. More than once I found myself laughing too freely, my cheeks flushed, aware of my husband's curious glances. The room felt both too small and too vast, the distance between what was spoken and was felt stretching thin as glass. At one point, while refilling a bowl of salad, I brushed against my neighbor's arm. He leaned in, voice pitched low for my ears alone. "You look different tonight," he said, his tone laced with mischief. "Happy, maybe?" I allowed myself a small smile. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just pretending very well." He gave a soft chuckle, the sound reverberating through me in a way that had nothing to do with humor. Our eyes met again, and the pull between us felt dangerous electric, as if the room had become a live wire only we could sense. After dinner, my husband suggested coffee in the living room, herding the guests towards soft chairs and small talk. The neighbor and I found ourselves standing side by side at the kitchen counter, rinsing plates and stacking them in the dishwasher. Our hands moved in silent choreography, fingers brushing elbows, knocking in a dance more intimate than any we'd ever shared in private. "Careful," he murmured, not quite smiling. "People will talk." I shot him a look, half daring, half warning. People always talk, they just rarely know what they're saying. He lingered, his touch a whisper against my wrist as he handed me a towel. The nearness of him, the scent of his skin, the certainty of what we'd shared. These things made my breath catch, made the world tilt. The evening stretched on conversations blending into one another, the lines between the lives we lived and the ones we dreamed of blurring more with each passing hour. My husband, perhaps sensing the subtle shift in the air, watched me closely. There was a question in his eyes I was not ready to answer. When the guests finally left and the door closed behind them, the silence in the house was vast, echoing. My husband turned to me, his brow furrowed, uncertainty etched across his face. "Did you have a good time tonight?" I nodded, the lie sitting heavily in my mouth. It was nice, different. He took my hand, squeezing gently. For a moment I wanted to lean into him to close the gap that had grown between us. But the memory of my neighbor's touch still lingered, hot and immediate, impossible to ignore. That night as I lay in bed, the events of the evening replayed in my mind. The clink of glasses, the shared glances, the accidental touch beneath the table. I felt myself unraveling threads of longing and guilt and exhilaration weaving through every thought. The boundary between what I wanted and what I had grew thinner with every breath, every memory. The night stretched before me wide and uncertain, and somewhere in the darkness I wondered if anyone could ever truly belong to just one life. Sleep was elusive that night, my mind tangled in the events of the evening. In the hush that follows a house full of guests, every sound seemed to echo. My husband's breathing, slow and steady, only heightened my own restless energy. I found myself lying awake, replaying every stolen glance, every electrified brush of my neighbor's hand. Even after so much caution and practiced restraint, it was astonishing how easily the boundaries had blurred, how fragile the walls between want and duty could become. The next day dawned overcast and humid, the sky thick with the threat of summer rain. I moved through the motions of morning coffee toast, a brief, almost absent-minded exchange with my husband about plans for the day. He seemed preoccupied, distracted, his eyes darting to his phone every few minutes. We were both haunted by something, though neither of us had the words for it. By mid-morning, I received a message from my neighbor. "Meet me at the cafe downtown. We need to talk." The simplicity of it, the lack of subterfuge, the directness sent a jolt of nerves through me. I told my husband I was meeting a friend for lunch, the lie tripping off my tongue with such practiced ease that he barely looked up from his work. I dressed deliberately, selecting a soft gray dress that clung to my body in all the right places, subtle enough for daytime but daring enough to remind me of the woman I was becoming. Underneath lace, a secret only I would know. The cafe was bustling, a place where no one would look twice at a woman waiting alone at a... He arrived 5 minutes later, rain flecked on his shirt hair, slightly disheveled eyes dark and restless. When he sat down across from me, the noise of the room seemed to fade to a dull thrum. For a moment we simply stared at each other, words failing us in the face of everything unsaid. He leaned in, voice low and urgent. "We can't keep pretending. This is nothing. I want you, all of you, not just these stolen moments." The honesty in his tone unsettled me. I looked down at my hands, fingers twisting the napkin in my lap. "I don't know how to do this." I admitted the truth, raw and unfamiliar. "I have a life, a marriage. I don't know how to be the person you want." He reached across the table, covering my hand with his. The gesture was intimate, unafraid. "I'm not asking you to destroy your life, but I can't go back to how things were before. I can't keep being your secret." I looked into his eyes, searching for anger, resentment, anything that might push me back toward safety. Instead, I found only longing, a hunger that mirrored my own. The fear inside me warred with the hope I saw in his face. "I need time," I said quietly, barely audible above the clatter of plates and the low buzz of conversation. "I can't just walk away, not yet." He squeezed my hand gently, and I felt the tremor in his own. "I'll wait, but not forever." Our conversation drifted then to safer ground: books, music, the trivialities of daily life. But the urgency lingered beneath each word, a tide pulling us toward a choice neither of us was ready to make. When we parted, it was with a look that promised more than either of us dared voice. On the walk back to my car, the rain finally broke, soaking me to the skin before I could find shelter. I drove home in silence, the city smeared in streaks of water and sunlight, every streetlight reflecting the confusion inside me. At home, my husband barely glanced up from his work. I told him I was tired, claimed to closing the door softly behind me. Alone, I sat on the edge of the bed, wet dress clinging to my skin, hair plastered to my cheeks. I shivered not from cold, but from the intensity of what I felt. Desire, guilt, hope, fear. I undressed slowly, letting the damp fabric slip from my body, and wrapped myself in a towel, seeking warmth. In the mirror, I studied my own face, the flush of my cheeks, the wildness in my eyes. I barely recognized myself yet. For the first time in years, I did not look away. That evening, the house was quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. My husband moved through the rooms with his own distracted energy, asking if I needed anything, if I wanted to watch a movie, if I was feeling better. I answered in soft, non-committal tones, too drained to invent a performance. He kissed my forehead with a tenderness that nearly undid me, and for a moment I wondered if he sensed just how much of me was already gone. In the solitude of night, I wrote a letter I would never send, pouring out every feeling I could not share aloud. I confessed my longing, my uncertainty, my ache for something real. When I finished, I folded the paper and tucked it beneath a stack of old sweaters, my secret, my confession to no one. The rain continued a steady drumming against the windows, and I lay awake listening to it, heart-pounding, knowing the time for indecision was running out. The next choice I made would change everything for better or for worse. And as the night deepened, I realized that the only thing scarier than losing what I had was never daring to reach for what I truly wanted. Thury night bled slowly into morning, a gray, tentative light seeping through the curtains. My body felt heavy with the knowledge that the hours ahead would demand more honesty from me than I'd given in years. My husband had already left for work, his absence filling the house with an unusual silence. I sat at the kitchen table tracing circles on the wood, with my fingertip rehearsing conversations I'd never had the courage to start. All the ordinary details, the smell of toast, the click of the clock, the drone of a neighbor's mower, seemed sharper, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. For most of the day, I wandered the house in of quiet preparation, folding laundry that didn't need folding, straightening books that were already aligned. I caught my reflection, often searching my own face for a certainty that still eluded me. The memory of my neighbor's hand covering mine, the frankness in his voice at the cafe, echoed through every room. I couldn't escape the truth any longer. The life I'd built, once so solid and sensible, now felt thin and brittle, ready to shatter at a touch. By late afternoon, the tension had become unbearable. I called my husband at work, my voice steady in a way I didn't expect. I told him we needed to talk that evening, not about bills or weekend plans, but about us. He was quiet for a moment, then said he'd come home early. I spent the hours before he arrived walking from room to room, collecting memories and regrets, unsure which would weigh heavier by nightfall. He came in just after 6, setting his bag by the door and looking at me with something like weariness in his eyes. We sat in the living room, neither of us touching both, waiting for the other to begin. I spoke first, my voice trembling but clear. I told him I was unhappy that I had been for a long time, that I didn't know how to find my way back to the version of us that had once been alive with hope and longing. I confessed that I had changed, that I was changing still, and that the safe world we'd created together was no longer enough. He listened, his expression shifting from confusion to hurt to a kind of hollow resignation. "Is there someone else?" He asked, the words soft, already resigned. I didn't lie, I couldn't. "Yes," I said, "but it's more than that. It's about wanting to feel alive again, to be seen, to be chosen, not just accepted." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the old mantel clock. When he finally spoke, it was with a calm that broke my heart. "Maybe we both stopped choosing a long time ago," he said, and there was nothing cruel in his voice, only tired honesty. "I want you to be happy, even if it's not with me." We sat in silence, grief and relief mingling in the space between us. There were no accusations, no scenes, just the quiet unraveling of a life built on habits and compromise. I reached for his hand, squeezed it gently, and we let go. That night I packed a small bag, nothing more than a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, my favorite book. I stood at the threshold of our house, memories flickering past like photographs, laughter in the kitchen, the weight of his arm around me in sleep, the dreams we'd once dared to share. I didn't know where my next steps would lead, only that I could no longer stay. I walked into the blue dusk, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and lilac. My feet led me almost unconsciously to my neighbor's door. When he opened it, there were no grand declarations, no promises, just the simple relief of arms that held me tightly without hesitation or demand. For the first time in years, I let myself cry, not from regret, but from the sheer release of it all. I was trembling, exhausted, unsure, and yet there was an unmistakable thrill in the uncertainty. I had chosen, finally, to live. The days that followed were not easy. There were awkward silences, sharp edges to every joy, the ache of what I'd left behind. But in the mornings when I woke in unfamiliar sheets, I felt something I hadn't known in a long time, hope. The shape of my life had changed, its future uncertain, but in that uncertainty lay the possibility of being truly seen, truly loved. Sometimes I would walk past my old house and pause at the gate, a bittersweet ache in my chest. I wondered about the life I'd left, about the woman I had been, but I didn't turn back. The world felt vast, and for the first time full of choices that belonged only to me. And as the sun rose each day, pale and indifferent, yet beautiful in its own way, I understood that whatever happened next would be a story I wrote for myself.